Chapter 5. Cryptic Behavior. Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on? J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit. The beauty of spring in the Black Hills is something slightly beyond description. By late August, everything has turned brown, and by late September, snowfall comes sporadically, but as the last snowfall of May develops, green hits fast. Inside 2 weeks, everything turns a deeper green than the tropics, and those colors stay right up until the last week of July when they fade. Accordingly, many local establishments tend to be named after the beauty of surrounding topography. This was the case with Jade Meadows of Trail. Jade Meadows was a stylish little pub centered on Trail's main street. It was just down the road from Gold Star Steve's, which was half casino, half pub, and full of pool tables. Either bar could be totally full or totally empty on any given night of the week, owing to the waves of tourism that came through the area on and off season. In the summer, there was hiking, camping, and off-roading. In the winter, a ski resort 10 miles away drew many visitors. Throughout the year, exchange students from the sand labs would make a habit of visiting the local bars. As small as Trail was, there was always something going on. That evening was particularly busy as it was the 4th of July. There was a pub crawl in town, starting at Jade Meadows and making a circuit including Gold Star Steve's and 5 other artisan breweries. Ethan had finished the crawl and returned to Jade Meadows absolutely wasted, but beyond wasted, he had started to slide into the style of the community. He was letting his hair grow out a bit and hadn't bothered dyeing the roots again. It actually came out black. Now there were frosted tips. He still kept the faux eyeglasses on him, but he didn't wear them as frequently as he had in San Francisco. His style had become more localized too. Just then he had a collared shirt with a reddish flannel pattern, a top t-shirt, and jeans. It was indeed still the 90s in South Dakota. The fireworks would start in about an hour, and he had an idea he could sober up enough to enjoy them. There'd be a good view from Carl's house on the dirt alley, but he hoped he could find a better vantage elsewhere. For a variety of reasons, Ethan found himself spending as much time away from his new landlord and the room he had rented as he could. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was always something off. With a hiccup, Ethan recalled that he didn't have anything to drink and motioned to one of the women behind the bar, who handed him a glass of water almost automatically and said, "Maybe you should try and get that down," before disappearing to serve somebody else. Ethan conceded that would be a good idea, though he never did quite manage to send the thought from his brain to his lips so he could share it. Cat, leave my water alone, please. Don't mind the cameo here. He had been in this state a good 40 minutes when one of the locals, who was an old regular at the bar, sat down on the padded stool beside him and without preamble struck up a conversation. "You're new in town." Ethan blinked a moment, willing his double vision away. Yeah, that's me. Sorry. Hiccups. You did the pub crawl?" "Yeah." The local chuckled. "I saw you stumbling from that burger joint across Lost Hills Avenue. You must have walked 5 miles today, son. You were wore out and hammered." "Yep." "Yeah. Well, I'm Terry." And he offered his hand. "Ethan." And Ethan extended his, barely remembering to grip this time. He was learning around here you either had a strong handshake or embarrassment. "You up in that house with old Carl?" Ethan nodded this time, barely managing to keep down a hiccup. He began to drain the glass of water the girl behind the bar had provided. Till then it had sat before him untouched. Terry continued, "Yeah, old Carl, he's been here forever. Guy must be 100. He's kind of old." "Kind of old," he says. "How old does he look to you?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. A little older than my dad would be, maybe, or... Hey, fam, check it out. Got rid of the hiccups. People remember Carl from back in the 50s, Terry continued. "He was younger then, but I mean, he's got to be in his 80s or 90s. How's he stay healthy up there?" The questions were starting to penetrate into Ethan a little. They spoke to his own misgivings on the present relationship. This worked to stimulate his mind, helping wake him up a bit. "I don't know. He walks the hill a lot, I guess." Never seen him on it, said Terry. Yeah, I guess I haven't either. Well, he eats whey protein. Whey protein, Ethan nodded. Yeah, big plastic buckets of it. And powdered peanut butter and vitamins. That's weird. Yeah. Seen anything really strange? Ethan abruptly recognized he was being an interrogated person. An obstinate portion of his mind decided to make itself known. Yeah, all the time, but no cap, like what are you asking me? He's weird maybe, but he's the only one anybody's seen living in that house. Well, except this young couple about 10 years or so before anybody met him. In the 40s or 30s. And they disappeared. Oh yeah. Yeah, huh? Yeah, Terry said. Hey, listen. Let me get another round for you here. Mia! Hey! A couple shots down here. In my tab. What? Whiskey. Crown. Yeah, Crown. He turned to Ethan. You like Crown? Yeah, sure. Me too. Yeah, Mia. Crown. Order finished, Terry continued his story. Some think the couple died and Carl was in the will, but there is another angle. Small town gossip, huh? Oh, probably, maybe, I don't know. What is it? Well, they say Carl killed his parents in the 30s or 40s and grew up by himself. Ethan had almost a physical reaction at that, making a dismissive noise and leaning back on the bar stool. That couldn't happen. And Carl's a pretty decent guy, is he? Well, I don't think he's too smart, maybe. He's chuggy, you know? He's not... I mean, he has a cat. Terry blinked for 2 seconds, laughed out loud, and slapped the bar, about which time Mia showed up with the shots. You got a point there, all right. Chuggy? Out of style. Here, Terry handed Ethan the shot. You just be careful up there is all I wanted to come over here and say, really. Cheers. They clinked glasses, and Ethan was drunk enough he swallowed it down in one gulp without a second thought. This turned out to be a mistake. He had an immediate burning reaction in his throat, and a wave of nausea hit him. In a rush, he lurched for the bathroom. Terry chuckled. Sorry, kid. Forgot the chasers. Ethan did not hear. In an armchair near a green-tinted lamp, and partially hidden by a stand-up piano, was a compact young woman with a pixie face and bright red hair that looked as though it were recently dyed. The entire time Ethan was in the bar, the woman's eyes did not leave him. When he finally realized he was the subject of voyeurism for a wicked man-sized beast staring at him malevolently with all intent of abuse and war, Ethan woke up fast and made noises. It gets hot in the Black Hills during summer. Sometimes it can get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a day or two. This is rare. Usually summertime heat peaks in the mid-80s through the region. But it was early July, and that was a hot period in trail. The sliding glass door of Ethan's little room gave on the muddy street and wild grasses growing right to the house's edge, pushing through cracks in old pavement on a small path just outside his room. He had the screen door, rather than the full glass door, slid over the opening. He needed the airflow. With the heat and the fresh air made him feel better. He had perhaps gone a little overboard in terms of alcohol consumption the previous night. Also, the city was a mile above sea level, which made the effects of alcohol more, shall we say, robust. With expanding consciousness, Ethan began to realize the wicked monster that had startled him out of a drunken stupor was, in fact, a 10-point buck mule deer sniffing percussively at him through the screen door. His cry had zero effect on the animal. Ethan's fear meant nothing. It was a lot bigger than he expected a buck to look up close, and he'd never seen one so near. They were all over trail and wouldn't run from you, but he had yet to encounter one right out of his bedroom in the morning. It was maybe 3 feet away. The buck seemed curious, and if it were possible, looked a little fed up with Ethan, as though he had been waiting there for the young man to wake up for a long while, and his patience were running out. In fact, the animal even motioned with his head a little, seeming to indicate that Ethan should follow the move. The shock of the big buck in close proximity caused Ethan to back up slowly on the futon, but his movements did not startle the animal. It waited and continued to sniff at him, making grumbling noises and stamping its hooves on the pavement. The room was indeed quite small. It was about a foot wider than the span of Ethan's arms. In the month and a half he'd lived in Trail, he'd set up a number of laptops and other technological equipment on a DIY desk acquired at a flea market. The flimsy desk rested against the stationary side of the sliding window. He had moved the futon against the long wall to give himself more space and usually slept on it in its couch form. "Big yikes," he said, blushing a bit. "Geez, Bam, you gave your fam a scare there. Dang." And eyes trained squarely on the buck, Ethan backed into the little hallway and out of his room into the main part of the house, where he literally bumped into Carl, who was shirtless, eating toast that had some sort of protein paste smeared all over it. "Morning," said Carl. "Man, you see this deer?" Simba." Ethan blinked. "No cap, you named him." "Yes." "And you named him Simba, like the movies." "I know a little about movies." "I thought you didn't watch movies." "I've watched your movies all month," Carl replied. Which was true. Several weeks after moving in, Ethan had showed the older man his DVD collection. Carl had taken special interest in his X-Files DVDs and had watched about an hour of them by July. "You named the deer after a Disney movie?" "Yes, many years ago. I've seen this lion movie. Funny that way. A deer is no lion. Simba likes freeze-dried apples. Hold this," and he gave Ethan the funky toast, which was not to Ethan's liking. Carl went into the kitchen and pulled a large tin can from under the sink. It had a picture of a sliced apple on its side and a plastic top. He popped the top, grabbed a handful, and walked through Ethan's room, saying, "Old Simba, it has been a while." "Yes." Carl slid the screen door back and fed the buck a handful of freeze-dried apples right from his hand. The buck grunted appreciatively until there was nothing left. "All done," said Carl. "See," he showed the back of his hands. "No more." The buck snorted again and shook his head. Carl said, "Be that as it may, that is all for today." As in rebuttal, the buck tossed its head once more and wandered back down the dirt alley. It was the first time Ethan noticed anything approaching a smile on Carl's face, even more than for his cat. Carl grabbed the toast out of Ethan's hand and said, "No reason to be afraid of any deer." You just feed the deer out of your hand?" "No cap, that's..." "Keep it to yourself. Deer are a nuisance to many. Not me, but to many. Some would rather the deer be afraid. There is good reason for this. They can be bad for property, dangerous for travel, but I like them." And with that, Carl opened the stained glass door to his bedroom a crack, slid behind it, and locked it, as was his custom. Ethan returned to his room and shut the screen door as well as the sliding door. It was more stuffy, but western clouds indicated a storm on the way, and he didn't want to have a close encounter with any other woodland creatures if he could avoid it. It was always like that with Carl. There was always something new and strange Ethan hadn't seen yet. He'd met sketchy people. Carl wasn't sketchy. He had a secret, but whatever it was, the secret wasn't something... It couldn't be as sinister as that guy at the bar had said, could it? Was that guy at the bar even real last night? What was his name? Barry? Jerry? Larry? Something like that. Ethan hadn't seen that guy before either. Also, to a certain extent, Ethan didn't want to know. He was only in Trail temporarily. There was no reason to nurture any bad blood toward anybody. Still, Ethan tried to focus himself, but the details were nagging at him. Who was Carl? Carl Marlborough. Ethan had asked him about that name only a week or so after moving in. "So you buy this place with tobacco money or something?" Carl was on the couch with Slinky beside him. She'd never sit on his lap, but she liked to be nearby. He looked up from some sort of nutritious paste he'd made for himself and consolidated in a bowl. "Tobacco money. Well, what kind of guap you buy this house with anyway? I figured, your last name's Marlboro." Carl looked at him very blankly a full 5 seconds, then slowly nodded. "Yes, that is my last name." "So you, related to the tobacco company, or what?" "No. It is a common American name. Sus, man. Sus. Suspicious. Like, the hell you say? I ain't never met no actual Marlboro man before. Ethan tried to make it a joke. Carl showed no discernible emotion. Yes, I suppose I have heard people say this thing. People confused about your name? Yes, this does happen. This has happened. But not in a long time. Not in a long time, Carl confirmed, then returned his attention to the X-Files episode he was watching and ruffled the cat. With that, the conversation was over. When Carl quit talking, it wasn't worth it to try and force the issue. He would merely respond non-committally in one-syllable words, as though it took less effort to ignore unwanted conversation than simply engage. Within a week or so, Ethan understood conversation would be short, direct, and end abruptly. Carl almost always ended the conversations, and usually it segues Ethan couldn't really predict. It did have this effect. If Carl spoke longer than normal, you tended to listen. He had an odd schedule, too. Sometimes Ethan would come home and there would be nobody. No sounds would come from the bedroom. The footfalls that normally reverberated throughout the small house were absent. You couldn't really hide when you were there. The walls were adequate, but thin. Break wind in the furthest corner of the house, whoever was at the other end would know. So there were times Ethan knew Carl was not at home, even if the man's room were still closed and locked. Then suddenly he'd walk out his room as though he'd been there the whole time. What was he doing? Was he just sitting on that bed, totally motionless in some sort of meditational hibernation? It really didn't make sense. The longest he'd been gone so far that Ethan could tell was about 2 weeks. In the middle of June, he'd suddenly returned at 3 in the morning, and he made a horrible ruckus. There were screams, there were cries, pounding noises. The cat yowled and scrambled out of the way somewhere. Things were getting thrown around, and Ethan got out of bed. The noise continued without abatement a good hour, utterly terrifying the young lad. He was frozen. He couldn't move. He began to tremble. Death was just behind that other wall, which conveniently trembled at that moment in the wake of something being thrown at it. This prompted Ethan to clench his fists, square his jaw, and turn the lights on in the living room so he could work up enough courage to knock on Carl's door. As soon as the lamp clicked on, the noise from Carl's bedroom stopped utterly, and within seconds, the stained glass door swung wide, naught but darkness behind. Carl had remembered his lodger. He emerged sober-faced, wearing a heavy coat as though he had just been to the North Pole, and apparently he was now in his right mind. His eyes were slightly glazed, but you had to look at him to even catch it. Carl said, "I apologize. I forgot. I no longer live alone." Ethan blinked, fighting the mental sloth that comes of waking in the night and the ebbing terror. His mouth opened, it closed, and he said, "No, man, you good." And he made his way back to his room, turning off the lamp as he went, and resolving to try and forget what he had just seen. When Carl ate, it was purely a matter of fuel, not a matter of enjoyment. As Ethan had told the man in the bar, it was Terry, that was his name. As he told Terry, Carl kept whey protein in tin jars. He also had peanut butter, powdered and the traditional variety, freeze-dried vegetables, various men's vitamins formulated for seniors, a water purification machine, and a variety of canned or dried meat options designed for long-term storage. There was nothing in the house that would go bad, as it were. It was as though the little cottage were stocked for the end of the world. Outside cream and coffee and a little toast here and there. Most rations in Carl's house were astonishingly unappealing to Ethan. Carl would eat what he needed, and that was that. He stayed healthy, and was neither too skinny nor too fat. Ethan had spent $1,000 at the grocery store the first week he moved in, figuring the old guy would poach a thing or two here or there, and be ingratiated to Ethan. No such thing occurred. Carl left what Ethan bought completely alone, unless expressly offered, in which case he'd only accept the smallest possible portion of whatever was made available. The oldster had the audacity to chuckle humorlessly when a few produce goods Ethan bought went bad before he got an opportunity to get to them. "It is inconvenient, is it not?" Things go bad quicker than you would like, he said. Another strange thing was the fact that there were never any visitors to the place. True, it was hard to get to. Ethan was surprised he'd found it in the phone on that first run. He seriously doubted this was the right house, and indeed no street number delineated it as its own property. In fact, the mailbox was up the street a good 50 feet from the house, cemented into the infrastructure of an entirely different property. It simply bore the address 303. Carl had showed Ethan this after he asked where mail came. Why can't they just put the mailbox at the end of your walk out by the alley? The winter, Carl replied enigmatically. Oh, haha, locals afraid of a little snow. Snow is piled at either end of the street. Carl said this of the dirt alley. It becomes slippery and impassable by vehicle. It is almost a real winter, though I have yet to see one here. Oh, real winter? As compared to, where? Carl looked at him sideways, then said, if you order a package from the internet, you must be ready for the delivery driver. It is unlikely he will find the house. I am surprised you found it as fast as you did. And in characteristic fashion, the conversation stopped there. It was as though the place were hidden, though in plain sight. Was this why it had no visitors? The house was some sort of glitch in the matrix, a property camouflaged amongst the rest, maybe. You could only see it from the right angle on the hill across town, except for the odd child taking a shortcut home from school down the dirt road. Nobody ever came or went on that corridor. No one but Ethan. And Carl? And Terry at the bar was right. Now Ethan thought about it. He'd never seen Carl take that hill. In fact, he'd barely seen him leave the house. He had to at least get the mail, didn't he? Of course he did, but nobody ever mailed him anything, did they? Ethan would learn the house ran on solar energy and, oddly enough, wind energy. There was a wind turbine that looked surprisingly ancient mounted on a corner of the house near several other properties. It was small, the size of a large fan used to cool an inside room. There was also water collection infrastructure on the premises, and as Carl recalled the wood stove in the living room, he realized this old house was almost certainly off the grid. Electricity needs were minimal, the refrigerator, a few lamps, TVs, and gadgets. He'd seen a lot of wind and snow even in the last several weeks. Proper collection and purification facilities would be more than adequate to cache natural water. Between wind and solar, a decent array of golf cart batteries would be enough to make an energy reservoir for such a house. You'd need about 30, but was Carl keeping them in the bedroom or something? Maybe. As to winter, it had been a few weeks, but Ethan had noticed a pile of logs beside the caved-in shed. He hadn't seen it at first, but over time he'd become aware. That must be the heat for the winter. What had he gotten himself into? Though Carl lived in the middle of a developed area, he was basically off the grid. He was not dependent on any infrastructure at all, except perhaps the internet, for which he paid a subscription that could be canceled. Beyond bureaucratic designations for the home, as long as Carl kept up with any tax bills, nobody'd ever bother him. What did Carl even do for a living? Ethan had asked him, and he had said something about remote sales, then refused to elaborate. Ethan suspected sales were bad, and this was why Carl needed the lodger? He seriously wondered if his 6 months' rent up front had given Carl a reprieve or something. Maybe he was just old, alone, and poor. But then there was the cat, Slinky. Sometimes she'd just turn up in his room, and he had the door closed, and he hadn't even seen her there when he started working. Ethan got a lot of work done, and he picked up a mini fridge, one that somehow didn't stress the hybrid electric situation Carl had going. Neither did Ethan's tech. In fact, and he had his tech running constantly. Whatever Carl had put together was certainly robust. In those first weeks, Ethan's primary focus had been on a number of software templates designed for small businesses who likely weren't used to engineering their primary website for smartphones. Such mobile devices, including tablets and other IoT, constituted more than 50% of web traffic worldwide. That meant businesses stood to substantially expand revenue with websites that had mobile device interface capabilities. So Ethan was putting together unique software to simplify the transition and simultaneously developing his own scalable Scrum process for fulfilling local client needs if he could get any. In the meantime, he was doing data entry for previous clients out of San Fran. As he'd expected, it was definitely smart to pay his rent 6 months up front. Working out of the Bay was getting more and more unpredictable and sporadic, at least in his chosen field. He might have to float off his cash cushion a year or so. So he'd been steadily putting together a number of translation sequences for a prospective website presentation to a local thrift shop owner when the cat suddenly attacked him and startled him into the glass window with a percussive bonk. That wasn't bonky enough. Ethan was consistently becoming startled at minutia, and he had to learn to control his instinct to run. "Slinky, the hell you get in here?" "Meow, meow, meow, meow." "Well, get out of here, would you? The door's... Dang, I thought it was open." Ethan opened the door, and the cat swiftly padded out. Had she been under the futon or something? Slinky did that all the time. Ethan was always careful not to leave the slider open unless the screen were pulled in front. It had gotten to the point where he would go over the room carefully, inch by inch, from the tiny hallway that led to the living room to the accordion-style closet, and everywhere in between, every nook and cranny. There was nowhere, simply nowhere, the cat could be coming into his room from, unless the cat came through the slider doors or through the main entry. Unless she did, there was no way it could get into Ethan's room. But Slinky showed up there all the time. He carefully checked the screen door, but it was in decent shape, if a little old, and while it could be broken, otherwise it would bar entry. His recent encounter with Simba the mule deer demonstrated that, if anything. Even so, Slinky always showed up. No wonder Carl put that addendum about her in the lease. Sometimes she'd watch him from atop the mini-fridge for hours before he noticed her. What was the deal with that cat, anyway? This is the thought that finally impelled Ethan to get up and do something with himself. It was July 5th, he was young, he had a little money to spend, and the hangover was going away. What use was it to sit around the house ruminating about his weird landlord? The guy was an old bachelor, that's all it boiled down to. Without a shower, breakfast, or even his fake classes, Ethan hit the road.